here, and what consequences were, and where we go from here.
Right.
And we want to have some communications around that. MacArthur Foundation, which partly funded the study, wants to support a communication strategy. And part of that is communicating with people at the state level, especially governors and state legislatures, policymakers. And we're trying to identify a short list of people who would be prime candidates to be sort of validators of the study. Maybe governors have been involved in the issue. The one name that's come up already is Nathan Deal, governor of Georgia. He's done a lot, I think, with that in his state. I don't know him. Would he be a good person to have on a panel if we had a high-level public session about the report?
I am not up to speed on what the interactions are between the governors and corrections.
Mm-hmm.
I can find out, though. I mean, they're just down the hall and let you know.
All right. Yeah, it'd be useful to know who you think are the
Yeah.
best governors, and maybe when we get to the stage where we're actually wanting to engage them, maybe we could.
Can you send me
help
something
out.
that describes it a little bit more, and then I can?
Not yet, but I will.
Okay.
Yeah.
and then I'll
I
get
mean,
you
I can
something.
give you the sort
Right.
of statement of task, but
Yeah.
you want to know probably the substantive findings of them that we have to wait on. Where do you want his water bottle to be? Over there?
That's
Okay.
fine.
So you know the background on why we're here, because you were part of the planning, thinking about it. This is part of the project that Paul Posner and I have been working on with you and Bill Hoagland and I guess Bob Reichauer at one point, to build a.
What's the Andrews Air Force Base thing?
That was part of it.
That was
yeah.
part of it.
So we've had
Okay.
a series of those kinds
Right.
of events. There'll be others, and then we're doing oral history. So we've interviewed Alice Rivlin before you, Dwight Ink, and last week Kylie went with Paul and me to Pittsburgh. We interviewed
Pittsburgh.
Paul O'Neill. So you followed Paul O'Neill.
I think I was instrumental in inviting Paul to a OMB luncheon seminar in the 90s. I don't
1988
maybe it was 88, could have been that.
where I remember I was new there.
Yeah.
Then, and he stood in the cafeteria.
Yes, in
and
the
talked
cafeteria.
about the importance of neutral brilliance. He said
Eh.
neutral competence, and then he said, but better yet, neutral brilliance.
Ah,
and that was
right.
one of the things that's quoted in the Phil Dame book about OMB.
Right, right.
And and I asked him about that.
Well, I was not there at OMB when Paul was there, but everybody said, given his rise, and that was before he became Treasury Secretary, I believe.
Oh no,
Yes.
that was when he was at Alcoa.
Yes.
After he left OMB in the Ford administration.
Right. So, anyways, I was one of those organizing that and invited him.
Well,
in,
it really stuck with me because I was new to OMB.
Ah,
It was
good.
It was inspiring. That's what I told him.
Good. Great.
He remembered it well. So can I just start by nailing down the dates of your tenure you started with GAO, is that right? Before you went to.
I was at GAO from
Years.
72 through 80.
Okay.
I was at OMB from 80 through 98. You want more than that?
No, that's good for now.
Okay.
Yeah, that's perfect. And then, what about CBO? 90.
I left OMB to go to the private sector for a year, and then in 99 I joined CBO and left in 2003.
Okay, and then
And
you were
then
doing
I am out
CD
for
after that?
2 years, 93 through 2003 through 2005, and then OECD from 2005 through 2010, and I've been here at NGA since 2011.
A long and brilliant career.
Long, for sure.
Are we ready? Are you taping? Here we go. Okay, we're gonna go.
Okay.
So, all right. So let me take you back to the beginning of your career. I guess probably when you were GAO, when you first encountered the federal budget process. If you recall encountering it while you were there, what your first experience was just at the outset. What's your first memory?
Well,
of it?
again, I arrived at GAO in 72, and the discussions to create the Budget Control and Impoundment Act of 1974,
Right.
which also created CBO, were happening at that time, and one of the leaders was the Assistant Controller General at GAO, who didn't get the job Alice did, and I don't recall his name now.
Mhm.
But anyways, he was involved in it. I did not work for him directly, but I was aware of the Budget Act and the creation of the Congressional Budget Office while I was at GAO. I even applied to OMB when I first started. I was in the Army here, and so when I got out of the Army, I applied and interviewed at OMB, but GAO offered me a job first, and so I took it.
Wow.
So I was aware of OMB and then aware of the creation of CBO, and I wanted to get into budgeting. It interested me.
What attracted you to it?
Well, I have an MBA, but as I was getting my MBA and specifically concentrating on investment analysis and financial relationships, the more I did that, the more I realized I was more interested in the public sector than I was the private sector. So I took every course I could in government and still get the MBA. By the way, I sort of had to do that because I got my MBA on June the 9th or something like that in 1970, and on June the 8th I got my draft notice. So I was drafted literally the day before I completed my education. So I didn't have a moment to lose, if you will.
Yeah.
Now, the draft notice is, you may remember, but you listen, greetings, it would say, greetings to the top of the, you have been selected. And I was part of the first lottery system, and I was number 194 in the lottery system. And they told me that they wouldn't go above 120. Then they said 150. The last thing I heard was 180. They stopped at 195, and I was 194. And despite that, I still wanted to work for the federal government. And I did meet a guy here at Fort McNair who was 195, and he and I are still friends. But I was interested in, since I'd say even the senior year in undergraduate and then in graduate school, even though I was getting at the MBA, I knew that I wanted to get into public policy. And the more I looked at it, the more I learned about it, the more I was just interested in budgeting. I liked the concept, I liked the trade-offs, I liked the program evaluation.
Which you did at GAO, I guess.
Which is, that's what my title was, program evaluator or something like that. So yeah, I did a lot of that. And the more I did at GAO, the more I realized I wanted to go to OMB or CBO.
So you went over there after 8 years or so.
8 years, right.
And then what was your first job at OMB?
My first job was in the housing branch. It was the examiner for the Federal Housing Administration. I had that account, and a few months after I got it, an examiner left, and I got, as you may know, a lot of the smaller accounts in HUD, fair housing, and I can't remember the other ones. But in one sense, it was a opportune time to be there because I arrived in 1980, but in 1981, Volcker, trying to kill the inflation, raised interest rates. The interest rates raised havoc with the housing market. I was doing FHA, and that included Section 235 and 236. I'm sorry if I hesitate. I haven't thought of these phrases for decades. So I did the 235 and 236 programs. Those were programs.
When FHA was the whole market for
the
a
whole
while.
market.
I got an FHA mortgage in 1980.
Oh, there you go.
For 13.5%.
13.5%. It got as high. I believe FHA got up to about 15 or 16 or something like that. And meanwhile, David Stockman, the new budget director, was doing a whole pile of things, of course, but one of the things he was trying to do was to prevent more monies from going into housing. And in particular, Dick Lugar, senator from Indiana, had a proposal that would have provided a massive interest rate buy-down subsidy. And basically, I worked directly with Stockman, not through the branch chief, not through the dad, not through the pad, but directly with Stockman on the analysis to oppose the Lugar plan. And we won. And I got to know him very well, and he got to know me very well. And not too long after that, the chief of the housing branch, Ken Ryder, switched me to the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Ginnie Mae account. And I got to say, I'm sort of thankful for Ken to doing that, because I didn't want to do it, but it really helped to have that kind of diversity.
Broadened you.
And that was also instrumental in my career, because at that time, a fellow by the name of Lou Ranieri, who was at Solomon Brothers, was developing this new kind of financial instrument, a mortgage-backed security or collateralized mortgage obligation.
Right.
And he had a mechanism. He had to get federal legislation because he had to make it apply to all 50 states. And so he had this mechanism, and he had sold the West Wing on it. I'm highlighting the West Wing because at one time Stockman called me into his office. It was just Stockman. I think it was Greg Ballantyne, the chief economist, whom I got along very well together. But it was the three of us. And it was my Mission Impossible moment. You may recall the old TV series Mission Impossible, and the guy would come in and there would be a plain vanilla envelope on the desk and a tape recorder. And he'd punch the tape recorder and open up the plain vanilla envelope, and every episode was the same. There was some despot someplace who needed to be eliminated, and only the Impossible Mission Force could do it.
If you choose to accept it.
But if you choose to accept it. But this tape will self-destruct in 5 seconds, and there'd be no ties between whoever was assigning this. Well, that's what Stockman he said, I want you to kill the mortgage-backed securities proposal that Solomon and Ranieri. He said, but the West Wing has already signed off on it. So if you get caught trying to kill it, I'll deny I've even ever met you. You know, I mean, so that was, well, I did my best, and I was a creative guy. He liked me, and particularly in FHA. He wanted to cut FHA, and at one time I went into him. Do you remember the old Paul Simon song, 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover? I came up, I said, Dave, I've got 50 ways to kill FHA. And none of them had to do with appropriations, and he loved that kind of thing. So I tried my best, and as is obvious, I failed. Fannie Mae layered the hill with money, and they got their way. However, in one sense, I didn't fail, because Treasury Department, who I worked very closely with, they felt much the same way, and we were able to take the legislation and put in certain constraints and involve Treasury in the issuance of these and review. And for 20 years, 25 years, things were all right. It wasn't until 2005 or something like that that the market really went to hell with all.
2008 they failed.
Yes, and they failed. But I mean, the issuance, the securities themselves, not just Fannie and Freddie.
Right.
Fannie and Freddie were a systemic risk long before I got there and long after, and then they finally failed. But the issuance of these securities, the combination of OMB and the Treasury Department throughout the 1990s and throughout the rest of the 1980s, throughout the 1990s, and in the first part of the 2000s, you didn't hear about these things. They were a relatively successful security, but then things fell apart. And my guess is there was something in the regulatory behavior or the push on the part of the Congress to get them into mortgages, like Altays, and I can't remember all this. You
Well,
can remember.
we could talk about that some
Yeah.
other time, because
Yeah.
I have part of the story too.
Right, you have part of the story too. But in any
Yeah.
case, back to my career, that was another instrumental part.
So you liked working with Stockman, and he liked working directly with examiners, I think.
Yes,
I've
he
heard that
really
often.
did. He really did. I mean, if he didn't like working with you, it was simple. You'd never get a call. You'd never go over to the old building. And if he liked working with you, he'd work directly with you. And the combination of the Luger thing and the Fannie and Freddie thing and other stuff. So after a while, Ken Ryder left. Alan Reinsmith got his job, but I got the job of the Commerce branch chief, which I held for a year. And then after that, I went into BRD. This was just at the end of Stockman's tenure, I think, in 1985, I guess it was. And I became the chief of the fiscal analysis branch and got out of housing and budget examiner and into that. And well, what? You want more? Then
That broadened your perspective quite a bit.
quite a bit.
And how was OMB functioning as an institution during that period?
Particularly my later experience at OECD, where I looked at budget offices around the world,
Right.
gives me a perspective that I didn't have while I was in the trenches themselves, but now looking back. OMB was under a massive shift that it was resisting, the career staff was resisting tooth and nail. The shift was from bottom up to top down. And for the creation of the Budget Bureau from 1921 through the mid-1980s, it was a bottom-up institution. By a bottom-up institution, the OMB would get proposals from the agencies on what their budget requests were going to be. This was true for mandatory and discretionary, but back then discretionary was much larger than mandatory, so I mean discretionary was the king at that time, but still it was true for mandatory. And the examiners and the branch chiefs and the dads and the pads would work together to take a look at these individual things and come up to them, present them to the budget director. The budget director would get some revenue numbers from the Treasury Department, put them together, and then they decide with the president if the set of proposals, including the tax stuff, and the proposed deficit or surplus was what the president wanted to do. But it started at the agency levels, went up to OMB, and then came up.
Right.
Starting with almost the first day I was at BRD, Tim Muris was over in the old building, and he was working with Senator Phil Graham to create Graham-Rudman. Graham-Rudman was classic top-down. You had a deficit. You had to hit a deficit. Therefore, you had to construct a set of budget proposals that hit that deficit.
Right.
Whatever the success or failure of Graham-Rudman, looking at it from how OMB ran those late 80s, we OMB was moving very much into top down.
Sure.
And I was, again, I worked very closely with Stockman and then Muris. And then I became, I mean, after a couple of years there, I became the head of BRD anyway, because I was the guy that they used to implement the top down. Barry, you take this to the dads and tell them what their allocations are. You do the guidance letters in the springtime. And then comes 1990 and we have these categories, and I was the keeping of the track of the categories. In fact, there were times there that I didn't even share all the information with my own staff. I mean, you couldn't let people know that there was an extra billion or two or 10 or something like that. And so Dick Emery gave me things, and Hugh Conley gave me things, and other folks would give me things, and I'd put them all together, but keep them all separate so they could have plausible deniability, you know. And but the big change there was from bottom up to top down, and how the institution. Oh, the older dads. Within a few years, they were gone. They could not take it. It was just so counter to the way that they had been trained as examiners and operated as dads for years that they left.
What would they say happened to me?
Well, they would fight it every inch of the way. Instead of having, I think you're more schooled in the top down, of course. Instead of saying, okay, here is our cap, we have to get meet our cap, meet our constraint, they would be coming up with one idea after another and trying to figure out ways to increase the amount, including gimmicks. And I think I have been associated with the word gimmick in the past, and I am not ashamed by that at all. I was very good at gimmicks when the president and the budget director wanted it. But by being good there, I was also very good at stopping them. And so I was frequently at loggerheads, the BRD staff, at stopping mechanisms to increase the amount of federal assistance to a program that tried to avoid the caps. But they would come up with all different kinds of things. It put BRD in a role BRD had never been in before. BRD wasn't exactly loved by the OMB folks in the first place, but now with this top-down and this policing of gimmicks and the way that it operated, moreover, I was, how old was I? That was, well, let's see, in 87 I was 40. So I was in my early 40s. And every dad, virtually every dad was older than I, some by considerable numbers of years. So it wasn't just, it was just different. And there was the age thing and the fact that I had the director's ears. I mean, I was close to basically all of them in my tenure there. It was a difficult time, for sure. Once the new guys came in, I mean, once the dads, to a lesser extent others, but once the dads got replaced, then they were schooled and bought into the cap type of approach, and it became much easier to do.
Interesting.
So that was by far the biggest thing.
Yeah. So it sounds parallel to the appropriators getting a 302A allocation and then having to subdivide it. And
All that was
enforce
involved.
that
Yes.
The resolution. It's very parallel to
Right.
what was happening in executive. Is that fair?
That's fair. Another thing that was going on that was also a big thing that fed into this, and to a minor extent, was CBO. I mean, again, from the old days, there was no CBO. There was nobody to second guess.
Right.
And all of a sudden you had this CBO. Well, I go back to the, CBO to me, I remember being, working with Rich Shepard, I think his name was. Does that ring a bell to you?
Vaguely, yeah.
He was the first CBO FHA examiner. And
he was still there.
And we worked together, and as I went up, I had regular dealings with CBO, and I was the contact at the high levels of CBO. Reischauer more than Alice, but others. Rudy was former OMB and had Rudy Penner, and we had him in. So to me, CBO wasn't the enemy.
Right.
You know, hell, I even organized with Susan Tanaka the OMB CBO softball game. You know.
Yeah, and the staffs always seem to communicate well. I mean,
Yeah.
that was my experience.
Yeah, but again, from the old line point of view, who are these guys? Who are they to say our numbers are wrong?
Yeah.
Why should we talk to them? We're OMB. It was a change, and a change that was hard for them to take. The third change that was hard, the 1974 Act, I believe, required 5-year budget projections. And Stockman did he did 3 years the first time, and then he went to 5. And I can still remember Hugh Conley, who ended up working for me in BRD at FAB, but I was still the housing examiner, the FHA examiner. And he calls me up in 1980 or 1981, I don't know, and he said, Barry, he said, I've been given, he and I played softball together, and he's also from the University of Illinois, so I know Hugh pretty well. Yeah. He says, Barry, he says, I've been given the assignment of doing I think it was 3-year, but maybe it was 5-year, budget projections for the whole government. He did it himself. It wasn't distributed. He said, and I've got a model, and of course he had the Social Security and Medicare estimates because those came from the actuary. He had demographic and stuff like that for the other entitlements, and for the discretionary portion, which again was very much larger than it is now, he had a model. The model basically took budget authority in the enacted year, inflated it, and then spent it out. And so he was doing the whole damn thing himself.
On a spreadsheet.
Except for me. He said, I can't use the BA outlay thing for FHA, which you may be familiar. He said, there is no relationship between the budget authority and outlays for FHA. You've got to help me out.
Before 1992, that's right.
Yeah, you've got to help me out. And I said, go to hell. I said, I can't do that. I struggle with 1 year. How can I do 3 years or 5? That's great. He said, look, you got to do it. Well, I can remember working on that for not an insignificant amount of time, although given all the demands we had, everything was demanding. And I'm so glad I did it. First of all, it schooled me in the value of long-term budget projections. But second of all, I realized that I could do my job better in the budget year if I knew what was happening in the out years, and that helped me a whole lot.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's fairly recent that even looking beyond 1 year is fairly recent.
Up until 1980, we're looking at 1 year.
Right.
And again, look at the attitude of the old guys, the old regime, before 1980, before 1985 or something like that. Everything was going to hell. Top down, CPO, long-term budget projections. It was, and I was so much in the middle of that, not particularly in BRD, that it was really swirling around me all the time, and I was sort of the mouthpiece. In fact, back in the early Graham Rudman days, Muras would hold meetings in my office at BRD, which was over there in the northeast corner at that time, and had a great big long table, and we could get all the dads in there and Muras and a few others, and so we'd hold regular meetings in there, and I would still sit at my desk, and then the dads. But then again, I mean, look at what these guys were going through. They didn't even get to go over to the old building. Muras would come over to the new building. Now, why he would do that? He wanted to talk to the dads without the dads. I think, and he wanted to get the input from the dads. I thought I still deal with Muras to some extent, and I thought he was a very, very good OMB political.
And very smart.
Very smart.
Yeah, maybe he's somebody we should talk
to. I would talk to him for sure.
Yeah.
And he had 2 tenures there too. Remember, he was there with Jim Miller in the
Reagan.
Yeah, but what was Miller doing at first? Was he OIRA?
I think so.
Yeah, he was head of OIRA. So Tim was in the OIRA section.
Oh.
Then he came back several years later with Miller when Miller became the director. So
and then he was part of the transition team, I think.
No, I definitely recommend it.
So he's one of the personalities that sort of looms large in that time. Were there directors or other people that you think had an influence on the institution or helped change your perception?
Well, Stockman for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I was about to say Pivicus. It's an acronym, program planning. something accounting system,
PPPS?
CAS, something like that.
PBPS.
Yeah, no. This was strictly Stockman within OMB. And basically, when Stockman arrived at OMB, the budget was done categorized in three ways: account, function, and program. Account for the appropriated, function for the budget committees, and program, four ways: account, function, program, and department. Account for the appropriations committees, program for the budget committees, department for the agencies, and program for the examiners. None of these satisfied Stockman. Why? Because none of them, the function was the closest, but the function was sub-function stuff. It was not at what Stockman wanted to address, and that is, what were the true programmatic impacts, including administrative and all other costs. So he developed this system. I think he did it in '84. He did it over a weekend. It came down again. I was at
CBMS, is that it? No, it was a system like that. That was.
CBMS was a division in BRD, and they were the ones that implemented.
Okay.
But it was PIBICAS that they were implemented. Yes. And I can still remember those yellow sheets of paper. I wasn't head of BRD then, but I was in fiscal. And he comes down with these yellow sheets of paper, yellow legal pads. And he had the entire government and every category on it. And he did it over a weekend, and basically it was right. I mean, we had a couple of minor things about where certain accounts would go, but so did it last? Not an hour after he left, but it certainly lasted in terms of how it got people to think about things.
We'll say more about that. Elaborate.
The classic in my mind, or you'd have an appreciation for this too, was credit programs and administrative costs. You know, you'd look at housing programs, and you may look at the subsidies that go to a low-income multifamily program, but would you look at the administrative costs of all the HUD bureaucrats that it took to provide those? No, because the appropriation for the HUD S&E, salaries and expenses account, came from a different place than the appropriation for the subsidy. This was even a bigger discrepancy or difference in credit programs, because this was before credit reform.
Right.
And credit programs were loan guarantees didn't show up except to the extent that you got a fee in.
Right.
And direct loans showed up at the full amount, no matter how good they were.
Right.
And the administrative costs, which could be considerable for both, didn't show up for either. In my early days at FHA, FHA examiner, I remember a part of this 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, going over to the HUD department, 13 levels of sub-basement, you know, and